morning, friends. The subject of my talk this morning is how Narendranath became Vivekananda. Before I go into the subject proper, let me chant a little bit, an ancient chant. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinah, Sarve Santu Niramayaha, Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu, Ma Kaschid Dukkha Bhag Bhavet. May all be happy. May all be free from diseases. May all see only goodness everywhere. May no one suffer from any misery. This is an ancient prayer. May God grant our prayer. Now let me come back to the subject of my talk. I repeat that the subject is how Narendranath became Vivekananda. When I was a child, I saw the picture of Vivekananda in our home. It was already very well known. Then when I grew up, I came to know that one of the main streets of the city of Calcutta in India are named after Swami Vivekananda. It's called Vivekananda Road, a wide street. And then there is some statue of Swami Vivekananda on horseback in the city of Bombay. And there are many, many cities which have streets named after Vivekananda. And on invitation, I had to visit Brazil 7 times. There, in a city, particular city, I met a young man who had come to see me. His name was Vivekananda. On inquiry, I came to know that his grandfather was a great admirer of Swami Vivekananda. Because the Parliament of Religions was held in Chicago in 1893, and his grandfather had heard the reports of that Parliament, I think. So he had become a great admirer. That's why he named his son Vivekananda. And this young man was a grandson of that person. And there is a street in the Curitiba city of Brazil which is named after Swami Vivekananda. It is called Rua Vivekananda. Rua is spelled R-U-A. That means the street and then Vivekananda. So, one may wonder, Vivekananda was a monk. What was he? Was he a monk from his very birth? Obviously not. So what was he before he became a monk? Some people are curious about that. That's how we got to know that before he became a monk, his name was Narendranath. Let me talk a little bit about that period of his life when he was Narendranath. He was born on January 12th in the year 1863. In Calcutta, I think, he was born. And his father's name was Vishwanath Datta. And mother's name was Bhuvaneshwari. His mother Bhuvaneshwari had two little girls who were born as her daughters. They died, and she was eager to have a child. And then she prayed to one Shiva temple. It is called the temple of Vireshwara Shiva, so that she would have a son. And that prayer was granted. So a boy was born, and they named that boy Vireshwara because he was born due to the blessing of Vireshwara Shiva. And his nickname became Bile. The name Narendranath was given to him later. That became his official name. And it is interesting that his grandfather, whose name was Durgacharan Datta, became a sannyasi, an all-renouncing monk, at age 25. And he was a very handsome person. And the parents of Vivekananda, of course that name came later when he became a sannyasi. His parents were amazed to see that the boy who was born as Narendra, he resembled the face of his grandfather, Durgacharan. And Durgacharan Datta was very handsome. And this Narendranath Datta, from his very childhood, he showed that he was extraordinary. He was a brilliant student, and he turned out to be a very good singer also. And he joined a wrestling club when he was a young man and became a good wrestler. Whatever he tried, he excelled in that. That was Narendra. And while in college studying for the BA degree, he became a member of an organization, or I should call it a reformist Hindu church called Brahma Samaj. This society believed in impersonal Brahman, would not believe in deities like Shiva, Durga, Kali and all that. And he became a member of that society, which is called Brahma Samaj. That means society of those who believed in Brahman only. At that time, he became interested in God, and he wanted to know if there was anybody who had seen God. So there was Narendranath Tagore, the father of the famous Ravindranath Tagore, who was the first Nobel laureate in Asia in literature. So Narendranath Tagore was a Brahmo leader, and he was still alive at that time. And Narendra, as a boy, went to see him. At that time, Narendranath was living in a houseboat, just as his recreation. And Narendra went to him and asked him, "Sir, have you seen God?" Narendranath Tagore did not give any reply. But he said to Narendra, "Your eyes resemble the eyes of a saint, a yogi." That's what he said. But Narendra was not satisfied. He wanted to find somebody who had seen God. Having studied many religious literature and having become a member of the Brahma Samaj Church, he wanted to find somebody who had seen God, but he could not find anybody for a while. Then, when he was 18 years old, that was the year 1881, and the month was November, he got to meet Sri Ramakrishna for the first time. And Surendranath Mitra, a prosperous gentleman, he had become an admirer of Sri Ramakrishna. So he arranged for a religious ceremony in his house. And in connection with that religious ceremony, he invited Narendra, whom he knew, to come and sing some devotional songs. That's where Narendra saw Sri Ramakrishna. Because Sri Ramakrishna had been invited, and he had gone to the house of Surendranath Mitra. And Sri Ramakrishna was charmed by seeing Narendra, young Narendranath. I should mention here something, that Sri Ramakrishna, who was a divine incarnation, once had a vision. And in that vision he saw 7 sages with their radiant bodies. They were in a higher plane of existence. Their bodies were luminous, and they are engaged in the thought of God. They are called Saptarshis in Hinduism. And then he saw that those 7 sages were surrounded by some light, and from that light came out a child with luminous body. And that child went to one of the sages and said, I am going, will you come with me? So that was the vision. Then he understood that child was no other than himself. He was divinity. He was going to be reborn. He was going to be born as a human being. And he requested, therefore, one of the sages to come to assist him in preaching his teachings, Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. Sri Ramakrishna was a divine incarnation. Whenever there is decline in spirituality, that God bodies himself forth and comes down to earth. And that is called an incarnation of God. So Sri Ramakrishna was one such incarnations. A divinity which took a human body. And when Sri Ramakrishna saw Narendra in Narendranath Mitra's home, then he was surprised to see that it is that sage, one of the 7 sages whom he had requested to be born, had been born as Narendra. He was eager to see him. He said to Surendra, I like this boy singing, please bring him to me another time. Then Surendra one day took Narendra and 1 or 2 others and went to see Sri Ramakrishna by a horse-driven carriage. Those were the days when there were no cars available. And Sri Ramakrishna lived in a place called Dakshineshwar, which is only a few miles away from Calcutta. And in Calcutta, Surendra lived. So Surendra hired a horse-drawn carriage and he took along with him Narendra and went to see Sri Ramakrishna. By seeing Narendra, Sri Ramakrishna was overjoyed. Then Sri Ramakrishna took Narendra out to the porch of his room. He lived in the temple complex, in a temple complex in Dakshineshwar. And there is a porch attached to his room. And he took him to that porch. And then he with folded hands, he said, so you have come at my request. Narendra was surprised. He thought, this Ramakrishna must be crazy. What is he saying? Then Ramakrishna touched Narendra. And that touch was wonderful. Narendra started seeing that the world was vanishing and his body was vanishing. Then he said to Ramakrishna, what are you doing to me? I have my parents. I don't want to lose them. Then Sri Ramakrishna said to Narendra, all right, all right. Then everything became normal for Narendra. The world became normal. From that experience, Narendra thought that this person, Ramakrishna, has some power. And he had asked Ramakrishna also, have you seen God? Then Ramakrishna said, yes, in a certain way I have seen God. And not only that, I can help you to see God, he said. From that time onwards, Narendra off and on started visiting Sri Ramakrishna in Dakshineshwar temple complex. So when he met Sri Ramakrishna for the first time at Narendranath Mitra's home, he was 18 years old. From then onward, for 5 years he came to have close association with Sri Ramakrishna. And he used to argue with Sri Ramakrishna. He said, Narendra was a member of the Brahma Samaj, and that society of Hinduism, religious society, did not believe in the existence of deities. They believed in only impersonal divinity called Brahman. That's why that society was called Brahma Samaj, the society of Brahmas, those who are admirers of Brahman. And then Narendra, having been a member there, would not believe in deities, that is, such as Shiva, Kali, Durga and all these things. So he mentioned that to Ramakrishna. And he also asked Ramakrishna, why do you go to the temple? And Ramakrishna was the priest of the temple of Divine Mother Kali in that temple complex. Then Ramakrishna did not give any reply. But it seems one day Narendranath had some experience, spiritual experience. There he most probably saw the Divine Mother Kali or something. Then he kept on coming to Sri Ramakrishna off and on. Then the time came when Sri Ramakrishna said to Sri Sarada Devi, who was spiritually married to Sri Ramakrishna. Sarada Devi was also a divine incarnation. They both came to revive spirituality on earth. But Ramakrishna said to Sarada Devi, I came here in disguise. I am like a king who wants to help his subjects. He puts on a disguise and goes to them and goes on giving them help. But if they recognize him to be the king, then the king cannot do that. The king has to come back to his palace. So some people at that time had recognized Ramakrishna, had a divine incarnation. That's why Sri Ramakrishna said to Sarada Devi, I am going to depart from this world. His body was his disguise. His divinity. His body was a disguise, so he wanted to get rid of his body. See, Sarada Devi understood that, and she said, well, you are going away, so what shall I do? Then he said to her, what I have done is but little. You have to do much more. And about that I talked a few days ago, what Sarada Devi did. Then, as Sri Ramakrishna wanted to give up his body, he developed cancer of his throat. That was also one of his disguises. He could have cured the disease in 1 second, but he didn't do that. There was a devotee named Mr. Nag. He had some spiritual power. One day he came to Sri Ramakrishna and said, "Let me take away your disease." And he was going to touch Sri Ramakrishna, but he said, "No, no, 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 you are not allowed to do that." Because Sri Ramakrishna needed that disguise to depart from the world. And when he was ill with throat cancer, his devotees, some admirers he had gathered, and they took him to a country house belonging to a rich person, and they rented that house. It is in a place called Kashipur near Calcutta. And Narendra and a few other young men who had become attracted to Sri Ramakrishna, they would also go there. Sometimes would spend 1 or 2 nights there also. And there, Narendra had heard about that which is called Nirvikalpa Samadhi. In that Samadhi, a devotee becomes one with divinity. So he requested Sri Ramakrishna to grant him Nirvikalpa Samadhi. Sri Ramakrishna said, "Well, not now." But Narendra insisted, said, "Please, please grant me." He had come to believe that Sri Ramakrishna was no ordinary person. He could easily grant him Nirvikalpa Samadhi. So then, after Nirvikalpa Samadhi, person loses body consciousness and all that. Only divine consciousness remains. That Sri Ramakrishna didn't want to grant Narendra Nirvikalpa Samadhi. He said, "You have to do the Divine Mother's work, so you cannot have that Samadhi now." But nevertheless, Narendra had a little of that in Kashipur country house. One day when he was sitting and meditating, he had that Samadhi. He lost body consciousness, only divine consciousness was there. Then when he regained the consciousness of the world, he said to one of his brother devotees, who were a young man who was also a great admirer of Ramakrishna, he said, "Where is my body?" So that was his experience. And hearing that from the mouths of one of those young men who had been there with Narendra, Sri Ramakrishna said, "All right, he had been pressuring me to have such experience. He has had it, but he will have to do the Divine Mother's work. Then he will have this Samadhi again." That's what actually happened. So he was in association, Narendra was in association with Sri Ramakrishna for 5 years. And when Sri Ramakrishna passed away, before that, Narendra was with Ramakrishna. And Ramakrishna asked Narendra to hold his hand, and which he did. And then Narendra started feeling that as though something like electrical power has been entering his body. And he started losing worldly consciousness. After a while, he regained his worldly consciousness. And then Ramakrishna said to Narendra, I have given all my spiritual powers to you. Did he give all his powers? Perhaps not, but he gave some powers. You have to do the Divine Mother's work. After the passing away of Sri Ramakrishna, and before that passing away, Narendra asked one day Ramakrishna, who are you? Then Sri Ramakrishna said, those whom you know as Rama and Krishna, they both are present in this. That means in him, as Ramakrishna. That means he was a divine incarnation. Rama and Krishna both are divine incarnations. After the passing away of Sri Ramakrishna, some of these young men who had become great admirers and people call them disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, they, with some of them, started living in a monastery. It was in that part of Calcutta called Baranagar. At that time, this Narendra and the other young men who are whom we considered as disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, there's such as Baburam, Sharat, Shashi, Tarak, Kali, Niranjan, Gangadhar and Sarada. These are the names. They went to the birthplace, which is a village called Antpur in Bengal. They went there. And there, they're sitting in front of a small temple. And then they took the vows of sannyasa, all renouncing monks. It is there when Narendranath became Vivekananda. Baburam became Premananda. Sharad became. So all of them acquired monastic names. And after that, this young sannyasis, they started living in that Baranagar monastery, which is an old home. Most probably Surendra and others had paid the rent for that, and they stayed there. At that time, sometimes they would go out on pilgrimage, walking all the way, because they had no money. And then Narendranath, who had become Vivekananda, he visited many places. And once, when he was traveling with his brother disciple Swami Akhandananda in the Himalayan region, then he went ahead of Akhandananda and he sat somewhere under a tree. And Akhandananda followed him and from a distance saw that Vivekananda was seated under the tree and he was talking to Sri Ramakrishna. Sri Ramakrishna had appeared there in person and was talking to Narendra, giving him some spiritual advice, it seems. Sri Ramakrishna was a divine incarnation. In his subtle body he would go and manifest anywhere. And even when he was alive, he used to go to Narendranath's study in Calcutta and would give him spiritual teachings. So Narendra became, when he became the main instrument of Sri Ramakrishna to preach Sri Ramakrishna's message. But Narendra was very eager to have that Nirvikalpa Samadhi, because Sri Ramakrishna said that he had that taste of it, and until he does the Divine Mother's work, he will not be having that Samadhi. So Narendra, who was Vivekananda at that time, he thought, no, I must try to have it. Then he heard about a saint, his name was Hari Baba. He lived in Ghazipur, in the state of Uttar Pradesh in India. So Narendra was able to go there. Hari Baba would spend most of his time in meditation, and the door of a cottage where he lived used to be locked. Only once a day he would open it. Then Vivekananda went to him one day and asked him whether Hari Baba could give him Nirvikalpa Samadhi. So he said, I will become your disciple. But Hari Baba saw the spiritual potential of Narendra and said, no, not yet. And then Narendra was staying there in a place in Ghazipur, and there he had the vision of Ramakrishna a few times. And Ramakrishna was sad because he had brought Narendra to preach his message. And eventually Hari Baba wanted to have some spiritual help from Narendra. He had some spiritual insight, so he could see the spiritual height of Narendra, Vivekananda. So he could not have Nirvikalpa Samadhi. While traveling in India, Vivekananda, he went to different places. He went to Cape Comorin, the southernmost tip of the Indian plateau. And beyond that there was the sea. And there was an island not far from there. But Vivekananda saw that island and swam across and reached that island. He is a great swimmer also. Then sitting there, he meditated and thought over India's future. He saw that the Indians were poor and all this. So he thought that their poverty has to be removed. But how to do it? By that time he had heard that a parliament, spiritual parliament, was going to be held in Chicago in the United States of America. That was the year 1893. And he wondered how he could do it. He thought if somehow he could go to attend that parliament, then Americans are rich, so he could collect some money, and bringing that money he could build some temple and or give some help to the poor people also. That's why all these thoughts had come to his mind. And while traveling in South India, two kings of native states. In those days, in the British period, there were some native states in India. Those states had their kings also. And in South India, there is a state in Ramnad, and the king of that state was Bhaskar Setupati. Bhaskar Setupati saw Swami Vivekananda and became very attracted and wanted to have spiritual initiation from him. Swami Vivekananda gave him spiritual initiation. And then the king of Khetri also became his disciple. And king of Khetri wanted to have a son. So he prayed to Swami Vivekananda so that he could have a son. And Vivekananda blessed him. And then the son was born to the king of Khetri. By that time, Vivekananda had decided to come to America. He was thinking of coming to America to attend that Parliament of Religions. And then king of Khetri was very grateful to Swami Vivekananda. So he had heard that Vivekananda was thinking of going to attend the Parliament of Religions. And why Swami Vivekananda wanted to go and attend that parliament, there is another story. While in South India he had a vision. There he saw Sri Ramakrishna walking on the sea and beckoning him to follow him to go to the west. And by seeing that, he understood that Sri Ramakrishna also wanted him to go to attend the parliament. But still, to be 100% certain, he wrote to Sri Sarada Devi, mentioning that he would like to go. And Sarada Devi blessed him and said, "Yes, you go, my child." Then he made up his mind to go to Chicago. And money was given for his traveling to America, going there by ship, by the king of Khetri. The king of Khetri's private secretary, Mr. Jagmohan, came to see Swami Vivekananda and said that the king was very eager to see him, at least for a day. Then Swami Vivekananda visited the king of Khetri, and Jagmohan took Swami Vivekananda to Bombay to board the ship which brought him to America. It was called, a ship. And also gave him money for his traveling and all this. That's how Vivekananda came to America. So he departed from India on May 31st, 1893. And by boat, by touching different places, even Japan, Hong Kong and all those places, he came to the continent of America. He arrived in the city of Vancouver, which is in Canada. From there by train he went to Chicago. And he departed for USA on May 31st, 1893. And then he arrived in Vancouver. From there by train he went to Chicago. And on September 11th, 1893, the Parliament of Religions was inaugurated. Yes. And Swami Vivekananda, by divine grace, was able to become a delegate. That is also another story. I could have talked about him for hours, but anyway, I have to cut it short. And then he went to the parliament, he was accepted as a delegate, and then on the day when the parliament was inaugurated, that is September 11th, 1893, he attended the parliament, and the president of the parliament wanted him to give talks, but he took time. He said, no, I'll later. At the end, he gave the talk, and he said, he addressed the audience as sisters and brothers of America. Just by hearing that, the audience was electrified. They went on clapping for several minutes. And eventually, he became very famous as an orator, and one American newspaper wrote about him. He is an orator by divine right. That is Vivekananda. And Vivekananda had to give lectures because he had accepted a position in a that is a lecture bureau, and they would pay him some money for lectures. So some days he had to give 3 lectures a day, and Sri Ramakrishna would come to him at that time and would tell him what he would have to say in his lectures. That was, and later on, after lecturing in America for a while, he came to a city in America. Near Boston. There he sat under a tree and then had Nirvikalpa Samadhi again. That showed that the Divine Mother's work had been done by him. That's why Sri Ramakrishna had granted him Nirvikalpa Samadhi. That place is Thousand Island Park in New York State. That's where he had Samadhi. After that, he went back to India, and then he was able to even to India twice there, and then went back to America again, and again he went to India, and he founded the Ramakrishna order of monks called the Ramakrishna Mission, with its headquarters in Belunwata. I have talked for nearly an hour, so I have to stop now, but I have to tell you one thing, that is, in 1902, while he was in the Belur monastery, the headquarters of the Ramakrishna order, which he had started, on the 4th of July, he passed away through meditation. Sri Ramakrishna had forecast by saying, Narendranath, that he won't live beyond 40. So he was barely 40 years old when he passed away. And he passed away while meditating. 4th of July in the year 1902. 4th of July is the Independence Day of America also. And so Vivekananda became independent of his body at that time. And he went to the other abode from where he had come, the region where the 7 sages were there, and he was one of those sages incarnated to help Sri Ramakrishna. This is the story of how Narendranath became Vivekananda, and as Vivekananda what he did. Thank you all very much for your patient hearing.